Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 18, That Word. Tearing her sword from the already disintegrating corpse of the Beowulf, Blake slipped it back into its sheath and affixed it to her back with a sigh. She had spotted a hill during her patrol yesterday that she had wanted to check out, but couldn't since she was busy protecting the house at the time. Instead, they had made a mental reminder to check it out the next day, and, for the most part, she was glad she did. The third unfortunate Beowulf to be cut down did dampen the hill's beautiful views a little though. Ruby really wasn't kidding when she said the Grimm tried to move in when the place was left alone. The day before, they had rushed outside 4 different times due to a seemingly endless amount of different Grimm types emerging from the forest. It was so bad that Yang had spent the night awake to keep guard. Breathing out a low groan, as she finally reached the hill, she started to climb up to the top. It was a bit steep from the side she was climbing, but the other side was a pretty long, sheer drop. After only a minute or two of scrambling up the rock face, she reached the top and looked out over the island of Patch. While not the highest hill of the island, it was still high enough to look out over the trees that littered the west side of the island. The sight was actually rather serene, so pulling a book from her inside pocket, she sat down on the grass and settled in to read while she thought over some things. The last 2 days had been a little awkward for her, but she was finally beginning to settle down. Last night, as she watched Yang fixing the flower bed under flashlight, Blake had thought on the girl's words and realized a few things. With how happy she had been at the party, with the admission of how much Ruby liked her and the kisses that Blake could still feel tingling her lips when she thought of them, she realized she'd been running a little hot. It wasn't too uncommon given her preferred reading material for Blake's libido to run high, but it was something she needed to get under control. So she had purposely repacked her more explicit books into her bag and shoved it under her bed, leaving out only her dramas and mystery novels. She had also realized that Jan was partially right. While Blake didn't want to, and would never, push Ruby in any way, there was the chance that Ruby would struggle with those first moves. Even when she felt those things were needed with Adam, Blake herself had struggled to go that far, and she was already fascinated with the books that were now hidden in her bag by that point. But Ruby was still new to dating, still unsure of how to cross those lines, and Blake holding that part of herself back completely wouldn't help. In fact, it could even come off as her being disinterested. That didn't mean she was going to start having heated makeout sessions with the Reaper. No, she was still adamant Ruby would be the one to make the first steps. But that didn't mean she couldn't take the initiative and show Ruby that she was fine with whatever step the girl wanted to take. If those steps took weeks, months, or even years, then so be it. There was one step that Blake wanted to take though, and that step was the cause of her small little hilltop getaway. That thing was a single word. Girlfriend. She had thought the word on a couple of occasions in the last week, and had even almost slipped up, both at the party and last night. As far as she was concerned, she was comfortable with that being their definition, but raising that subject was awkward. Despite having kissed a couple of times, and having admitted to really enjoying spending time together, Blake wasn't sure if Ruby was on that page yet. It was a rather forward step to go from dating to girlfriends. One was fluid and offered some relief from pressure, the other was static and confirmed something more serious. But with 2 dates past, and her feelings only growing stronger, Blake felt it was something she needed to talk to her about. If Ruby wasn't on the same page, then so be it, but it was a clarification that Blake needed. She hoped the novelette she was reading would offer her some ideas on how to broach the subject, as it was a short relationship drama of 2 childhood friends beginning a romance. Books had always been a good guide for her, and an even better outlet from her own life. Aside from her favorite reading material, she tended to stray towards the more real novels, stories that weren't afraid to shy away from the darkness that came with real life. Though people would usually stray away from what reflected their lives, Blake often felt a book that refused to acknowledge the ugliness was far too idealistic. While she did enjoy the occasional lighthearted novella or even a comic, the latter being much more fun when read with Ruby, the stories never really left her fulfilled or inspired. She hoped the story in her hand proved differently on the latter. The book wasn't long at 79 pages, nor was it particularly deep, but she easily found herself liking the characters presented. They were simple, but that simplicity suited their situation and only accentuated the awkwardness of them falling in love. The story was equally as simple, but managed to convey the sincerity of the situation enough that Blake could find a common ground. However, after an hour of silent reading to herself, she reached the end and found herself disappointed. The friends had simply given in to their urges and kissed. There was no conversation of what they were, no understanding, just them submitting to their feelings. And while it certainly matched the story told, it didn't help with Blake's problem. So with a sigh, she set the book aside and leaned back on her arms. Breathing out a sigh of frustration at not having chosen the right book, she looked over the forest before her. Instantly her senses locked onto a cluster of trees that were moving more than the wind could ever cause. Though it was a small distance away, Blake noticed they almost seemed to bend before cracking back into place, only for the trees in front of them to mimic the action. She knew instantly it was a grim, and a rather large one at that, as even Ursa Major couldn't move such thick trees so easily. Leaning in slightly to try and catch a glimpse of what was causing such a disturbance, Blake felt herself freeze as two trees stopped dead while being pushed apart. Sitting there quietly, she held her breath, but felt her heart rate pick up. And then it happened. One of the trees began to return to its normal position, but the other kept bending, the strong body twisting as it turned towards her. More trees along its path began to bend, and after a couple of seconds, a loud crack filled the air as the truck fell to the floor. Blake shot her feet and shoved the book back into her jacket, watching the trees once again begin to move. This time, however, they were being shoved aside in a path that was headed straight for her. Feeling herself shake as she knew that she absolutely would not be able to take on whatever that was alone, she turned and took off at a sprint, making sure not to head straight for the house. If it was following her, the last thing she wanted was to lead it back there. As she ran, she reached up to her ear and tapped her team communication earpiece to start the voice call function, and called Ruby to give her a heads up. It hadn't occurred to Ruby just how much she had become accustomed to the loud noises of Vale before, but as she walked through the shopping district of Patch with Yang and Blake, the difference was obvious. Unlike Vale's massive shopping district that was filled with malls, and so many people that you often had to squeeze your way through, Patch's was simply one large square. Only a couple of stores lined it, two of which were grocery stores, while the others were for rather specific needs. A single computer store, one weapons store, a garage, a couple more that suited the island's inhabitants' basic needs, but for anything other than that people had to travel to the main city. In the center of the square was a grassed area with benches and tables. The trees that stood there were usually green, but were stripped bare by the winter, though in the spirit of the approaching holidays, they were wrapped in lights before the weather got too cold for anyone to stand. The area was a common gathering place for students and adults taking a rest from their shopping, and even in the cold weather there were a few people gathering around the gazebo that stood in the middle. While Ruby would have really liked to relax in the gazebo after a long morning of killing Grim, she knew they couldn't stay away from the house for long. Ideally, they wouldn't have had to go out at all, as Grim would no doubt try to capitalize on them not being there, but the cupboards had been pretty empty, and they really need some groceries. So knowing they couldn't do without them until their dad returned, Ruby had reluctantly left the house to the Grim, knowing that they would have to fight them off when they got back. "It was?" Blake asked Yang curiously. The two had been conversing the whole way, and had finally got to the subject of some large Grim living in the forest. "The help, most likely," Yang shrugged, waving to some old friends. "You said it was pushing trees aside easily?" "MHM. At least it's moving away from the house," Ruby reasoned as they made their way towards the store. "Not sure we could handle it without Dad." "Are you kidding?" Yang scoffed and slammed her fists together. "We're Team RWBY. And even we have our limits," Blake replied, Ruby pointing to Yang's pocket, and Blake using her free hand to sneakily steal the scroll that was hanging out of the blonde's pocket and handing it to her. Giving the girl a mischievous grin, Ruby quickly input her sister's password. A picture of Velvet greeted her, the rabbit faunus grinning happily as Yang and Coco kissed a check each, and Ruby felt a smile pull at her face. Quickly opening the pictures as she knew she didn't have long, Ruby found the folder labeled RWBY and quickly scanned through for a decent picture. Finally she found it, a snapshot of Weiss glaring angrily at the camera with her arm raised back ready to throw a book. It wasn't an uncommon reaction, and as such, Yang was the only one who ever dared to take the heiress picture. Selecting it, she pulled down the menu and found Weiss' number. 2 days, and I already miss you throwing shit at me. Besides, Weiss isn't here, so we're a member down, Blake continued as they neared the store before turning to whisper in Ruby's ear. Yang doesn't type like that. Oh, right, Ruby replied and quickly corrected it to read much worse, and throwing a wink at the end. After hitting send, she closed out of the files and prepped to hand it back, but was struck by a sudden spark of inspiration and opened the settings. With a few clicks, she changed the language to Elysian and closed everything again. Passing it back to Blake, who rolled her eyes with a grin, the girl slipped it back into Yang's pocket just in time for them to arrive at their destination. The moment the door opened, the smell of cinnamon filled her senses as warm air rushed past her. The business had originally been two separate stores, a general goods store and a bakery, but after the owners had begun a relationship and got married, they decided to turn it into one big store. It was actually one of the biggest and most popular shops on the island, and the couple were old friends of their family. Well, pretty much every family on the island. As they combed the shelves, Ruby picked up a basket and made her way to the confectionery section. Groceries were important, there was no doubting that, but so were cookies. Without the delicious baked goods, how could anyone be expected to keep their spirits up? It was almost impossible. So shoving 4 large packs of double chocolate chip cookies into her basket, along with some plain ones for Blake and a pack of strawberry chocolates for Young, Ruby made her way back over to the other girls and received a playful eye roll from both of them. Once everything they needed was obtained, the group made their way over to the counter where a woman with forest green hair gave them a warm smile. "Well, it has certainly been a while since you two have been in here," Kelly said kindly and began to scan the items. "You're a new face, though." "A little too long, this is Blake," Young said happily with a motion to the faunus, who was inspecting a fridge with what looked to be a fresh cod on a bed of ice. "But yeah, Beacon keeps us all pretty busy. How are you and Beryl doing?" "We're hanging on," the woman said easily, though Ruby noticed her smile falter a little. "Still getting over what happened, though." "Huh?" Ruby asked, earning a confused look from the woman before clarity passed across her eyes. "Oh, you wouldn't have heard, would you?" she said sadly. "Miss Matt's daughter, Pearl, went missed last week. The Zans found her body yesterday. Poor girl must have wandered into the woods and ran across some grim. Fuck." Young breathed out angrily. "Didn't she just turn 15 last month?" As Kelly gave a small nod with a grimace, Ruby felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She had known Pearl from Signal, but she wasn't part of the Huntress course. She was a sweet girl, super inquisitive, and always tried to help. Not that she could think of anyone who did deserve such a fate, but she certainly couldn't think of anyone who deserved it less. "How are her parents?" she asked, knowing the family had been pretty close. "And her brother?" "Not good," Kelly said with a sigh. "They've moved to the city to grieve, but are returning to bury her here. Feels like that's happening more and more lately, though." Ruby understood what she meant and gave her a small nod. Though Patch was extremely close to the main city, they still struggled with Grim. Those Grim often brought death, which in turn caused negativity that would very easily spread like wildfire. When someone was cut down, the family would normally leave the island for a while, so that their grieving didn't draw more Grim to the rest of the inhabitants. It wasn't a rule that was forced on people, or even expected, just a courtesy that the people of Patch had developed over the years to keep their friends and families safe. "Yeah, we've heard Grim are become more active too," Blake said gently. "I'm sorry you lost a friend." "Thank you," the older woman said with a kind smile. "I'm just glad there are people like you three rising up to protect this world. I'll rest easier at night knowing the strongest huntresses to come out of Patch are back for a while." "Well, you can call on us if you ever need anything, Kelly," Ruby replied comfortingly. "Yeah, you have the number for our home phone, and we move surprisingly quick when we need to," Young added. "I will keep that in mind," she said and finished up scanning and packing everything. "Will this be all?" "Yeah." "Wait," Ruby interrupted her sister and pointed to the fish Blake was still eyeing. "Can you keep that aside for us too? We'll collect it before we head home." "Of course." The woman smiled as Young handed the lean over. "Please take a cookie each from the bakery too. On the house, of course." With a small nod, Young accepted the change as Ruby retrieved the cookies and Blake picked up the bag. Walking back to the door, they found themselves stopped as the woman called out to them. "Oh, I almost forgot. The funeral is on Friday at noon, in Cheer Clearing." Ruby exchanged a look with Young. They could both tell that it wasn't just an invite, but a request to protect what would no doubt be a situation with a lot of negative emotions. The look was merely one of confirmation, however, as it was clear that both of them were thinking the same thing. So with a smile, Ruby turned back to their family friend and gave her a nod. "We'll be there," Ruby said firmly. "And you can count on Team RWBY. Well, 3 of my team anyway. I'll let the Mattis know." Giving the woman one last smile, Ruby, Blake, and Jan left the store, and all 3 of them let out a deep sigh. Without saying a word, Jan walked off on her own, and Ruby kept Blake from going after her with a simple shake of her head. For all Yang's claims of adventure, Ruby knew she loved the people of Patch. Minnie had helped her after summer passing with quite a lot of things, and that was important to her sister, so Ruby knew she needed a minute to collect her thoughts. Seeing the look in Blake's eyes, though, she gave her a small smile and pulled her towards the gazebo to sit down. After receiving such news, Ruby simply wanted to sit down and relax with the person who made her happy. "Any sugars, dear?" "Yes, please," Blake replied kindly to the gray-haired woman as she accepted the drinks. While Blake would normally consider adding sugar to hot cocoa to be completely unnecessary, she was starting to come around to the idea, as it more often than not caused a contented smile to paint itself on Ruby's face. Something about copious amounts of sugar seemed to always bring Ruby immense amounts of joy, and Blake wanted Ruby to have that joy again. She knew what it was like to lose a friend to Grimm, so wasn't surprised by how quiet Ruby had been since they had found out. Even she was saddened by the news, as, while it was unfortunately not too uncommon, 15 was far too young for a life to end. Though they had first been sad at what Blake had to admit was a wonderful gazebo waiting for Young, the weather had unfortunately took a change for the worse, and they had darted into a cafe before the rain could flood the previous structure's exposed sides. It wasn't too busy, with only 3 other people, who had waved when they entered, sat at a nearby table, and the whole place smelled like a wonderful mix of coffee and chocolate. While she was partial to tea herself, those smells were definitely better for a rainy day. Setting the drinks down on the table they had chosen, Blake took her seat opposite the slightly gloomy girl and gave her a soft smile. "Did you know her well?" she asked carefully. The reply wasn't instant, as Ruby went about adding 3 more sugars to her drink, but Blake didn't push her, instead simply waiting and sipping her tea. After a minute or two, Ruby raised the drink to her lips and gave a small nod. "She used to watch me train." Ruby sighed and placed the cup back onto the table. "She tried to learn how to fight herself for a while, but she just wasn't cut out for combat. I don't know why she would have gone into the woods." "I'm sorry," Blake offered. She knew it was weak, but she had no idea what could have made a girl who couldn't fight run into the woods alone. "Thanks." Ruby sighed again and played with the spoon in her drink. "I'm concerned, though. Grimm seem a little too active, even for Patch." "Coco said they have been migrating too." Blake nodded. "We can check it out if you want." "Tomorrow," Ruby said with a firm nod of her own, her mind obviously already made up on that anyway. The Xants found her, so she was likely somewhere around Peel's Pond. "Then we'll start there." With a hum of confirmation, Ruby took another sip of her drink, and Blake reached out to work her fingers between the reapers. Thankfully, that action along with the sugary drink seemed to finally pull a smile from her, and Blake happily returned it. "Thanks," Ruby said, her tone noticeably cheerier, though still holding a little gloom. "Finding out what happened to her might help her parents. I can hardly say no to my girlfriend's attempt to Blake cut herself off immediately, as she recognized what she had just done. It had not been a thought, or an easily cut-off word this time. No, she had flat out said it while her mind was focused on cheering the girl up. And from the reaction, Blake knew Ruby had definitely noticed. The young brunette's thumb had stopped the gentle stroking of the back of her hand that Blake liked so much, and her eyes had widened a little. It was tough to tell what the girl was thinking as she looked into the wide silver orbs, so with doubts running through her mind, Blake looked away to stare at her tea in hopes that the silence would ease the situation. However, after almost 3 full minutes that Blake counted in her head, the silence became a little too much for her. Sorry," she stuttered, not looking up from her drink. "That was probably too soon. And hardly the right time." I don't mind," Ruby said in a soft voice. I didn't know you were there yet." Looking up, Blake saw that the silver eyes were resting on her, and there was a twinkle in them that made Blake unable to lie. So taking a deep breath to settle her uncertainty, she gave Ruby a small shrug. "I am. If you're not, then it's fine." The silence that followed didn't last long, and Blake felt Ruby's thumb move on her hand again. Watching as Ruby's face broke into the very grin that she had hoped the hot cocoa would achieve, she felt her stomach do a backflip and her heart begin to race. "I thought I was the only one thinking it," Ruby said with a hint of relief. "That I was moving a little too fast." "Oh," Blake said, unable to suppress her own grin. "So, if we are both thinking it, should we make it official?" Ruby's head had barely finished nodding when Blake leaned across the table and pressed her lips against the girl's. She could feel the smile pulling at them as Ruby quickly returned it, and the two of them let out a relieved breath, glad that they had finally sorted that out. However, before they could choose to part, which wouldn't have happened for a while, the loud ringing of the door's bell rang through the room, and the two of them broke apart to see Yang's hulking form in the doorway. Her hair was dripping wet, though not much more than the rest of her, the blonde strands hanging wildly across her face. Every single part of her mud-covered clothes clung to her body from the moisture, and murky water dripped from her, as more rain added to that. In fact, she was so thoroughly soaked that the owner of the store held up a hand to tell her not to come in. With a small nod to the gray-haired woman, Yang glanced over to them, and they both stood up to make their way over to her. As Blake drew closer, she noticed that one of Yang's ember silica was completely out of shells, and a large scratch mark had been carved into the paint. It was obvious the girl had sought a fight, and that whatever she had found was no longer living. Thankfully, the brute's eyes seemed to have settled from the stormy anger Blake had noticed when they had left the store earlier. "You two ready to head home?" The voice was strained, but calm, whatever emotion the girl had been battling having long since passed. So looking to Ruby to find reassurance in her silver eyes, Blake looked back and nodded. As they left the store, she saw Ruby sneak the scroll from her sister's pocket herself, and quickly change the language back to normal. Chapter 19. A Soothing Song. Pulling her coat a little tighter, Blake let out a small breath that instantly turned to fog. The day was another cold one, probably the coldest of the year so far, leading to her choice in clothing being her leather catsuit for once. The tight fabric was a tiny bit restricting, but the fact it kept body heat trapped inside, and the frigid wind outside, were benefits that far outweighed such a small negative. Another thing that was good about her outfit was that Ruby's eyes had flown wide open when she had entered the kitchen wearing it. Despite knowing they were going on a mission of sorts, Blake couldn't help tease her girlfriend a little. With the outfit being very form-fitting, she had enjoyed feeling Ruby's eyes on her whenever she reached into a top cupboard for sugar, or stretched in preparation for the mission. They may have been taking things slow, but knowing Ruby was definitely interested, along with seeing the flustered look on her face whenever she thought Blake had caught her looking, was a little too cute to resist. She had even waited until the last possible minute before putting her coat on, something that Yang had remarked about as they left the house. The coat itself was a beautiful, white tailcoat with light purple accents, and had been a gift from Weiss after the heiress saw her eyeing it for nearly a week, so she was always cautious about wearing it overmuch. However, despite how thin it was, the material was designed to keep the wearer warm during cold weather, so it was also too good to pass up on such a cold day. Unfortunately, even with her clothing designed to keep out the cold, it was still managing to sneak its way in through the tiniest gaps. As she pushed her way through the trees though, she returned her thoughts back to the mission. She was currently following a track she had picked up roughly 5 minutes ago. She had no idea if it was the right one, as there were no prints due to yesterday's sleet fall, but the broken twigs she was following were definitely not broken by Grimm. Taking a knee as she found another, she heard Ruby and Yang stop behind her. "Find something?" Yang asked, just as she did every time Blake stopped to check. Blake didn't mind, of course, as she knew the blonde simply wanted to know when she could punch whatever had killed the girl. It was, however, a decent clue this time. While it was just another suspiciously snapped twig, the direction was consistent with all the others she'd found so far. So giving a short nod as she stood up, Blake pointed in the direction she was certain the tracks were headed. "They seem to be leading that way," she said firmly. "That's Peel's pond up ahead," Ruby said with a hum. "Guess I should have gone with my gut instead of starting where she was found." "No, it's good you changed your mind," Blake clarified. "Had you been wrong, we would have wasted a day searching the area. At least now, we have confirmation she came from that direction. And what she was doing there." Both Blake and Ruby gave Yang a confused look as they had no idea what the blonde was talking about, but thankfully she quickly filled them in. "She had a date," Yang groaned with a shake of her head. "Peel's Pond is a dating spot. All the Signal kids know that." "I didn't." "Well, you never had a date, and graduated before you could. Oh, true. If she had a date, then surely there would be someone else missing, Blake said, and continued their walk towards the pond, making sure to push Yang aside so that she didn't scuff the tracks, just in case they were still needed. We would have heard about that yesterday, right? I dunno. Yang shrugged and slipped her hands into her pocket. Hopefully whoever is was got away, or didn't show up. As shitty as that sounds to say. Blake understood Yang's meaning on the last part. It felt callous to say, as it meant Pearl's last thoughts might have been that she was stood up, but it also meant that person would have avoided what was obviously a very deadly situation. As she thought about it, she was glad that situation would never arise with Ruby. While the Reaper seemed to have a little more trouble with fighting people, she was more than proficient at taking out Grimm. Blake actually quite liked that about her girlfriend. Ruby cared about not hurting people so much that she always had trouble committing to an all-out attack, but when it came to Grimm, she was like a surgical instrument. Never a wasted strike, never a missed opportunity. Watching her fight the bloodthirsty creatures was like watching an artist paint a masterpiece. Maybe, Blake said quietly as Ruby came up to her side. You two know what's on this island. What do you think did it? Dunno, Ruby said with a sigh. None that I know of. Kelly said she had small scratch marks on her, but Signal has classes on how to escape ill rules. She also smelled like seawater apparently, but there are no underwater Grimm this far inland since we have blockades where the river meets the ocean. Yeah, Yang agreed thoughtfully. Could be something new though, been a couple reports of new stuff lately. If it is, then we'll need to tread carefully. Study as much as we can before we kill it, then report straight to Ashbin. New Grimm are bad news. Agreed, Blake hummed. Huntsmen and huntresses weren't just tasked with the extermination of Grimm, though that was their main job. They were also tasked with gathering as much information about them as possible. It was dangerous to come across a new species for the first time, as they would always provide a new challenge, but that was exactly why it was important. Gathering intel helped others, who encountered it in the future, meaning less people were likely to die. Of course, the Grimm dying took precedence if it was too dangerous to study, but studying them was always encouraged. Fortunately, she wouldn't have to wait much longer to see if it was a new species, as they quickly arrived at the pond. Pushing through the trees, her eyes fell upon a body of water that was a little bigger than she expected. It was actually quite beautiful, the still water reflecting the cloudy sky while small bushes lined the bank, each one glittering from the frost that clung to its brambles. Nothing immediately struck her as odd, but clearly something had caught Ruby's attention as she took a step forward and focused on the water. Something wrong? She asked, alert just in case she needed to track something. The pond should be frozen, Ruby replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It always is this time of year. Ruby was right. With how cold it had been the last couple of days, there should have at least been a thin layer of ice across the pond, but there was nothing. Suddenly the beauty the pond had possessed before turned ominous, and Blake drew her weapon, as did Ruby and Yang. You think whatever attacked Pearl is still here? Yang asked, following Ruby's lead and keeping her voice quiet. Could be. Ruby hummed and raised the sniper, using her scope to check the other bank. Fan out. Search the bank for clues, but don't get too close and stay quiet. If it hasn't realized we're here yet, then we keep the element of surprise. But if you see anything that looks like a Grimm, shout. Got it, Blake and Yang said, both of them splitting off in the opposite directions and activating the team's comms, though hers seems to be messing up and giving a slight bit of feedback. Ignoring the slight humming in her ear, as she could still hear Yang and Ruby just fine, Blake kept one eye on the ground and one on the water. As she walked slowly around the bank of the pond, she felt the wet mud slosh around beneath her feet. Ruby was right in that it wasn't normal. In such cold weather the lake should definitely be frozen, and the bank should be hard with frozen mud. Looking towards the water properly, she gazed into it and tried to see anything. Thankfully she saw nothing. Good, maybe it's moved on, she thought to herself, returning her gaze to the surrounding area. This place really does make a good dat. Blake cut out her thoughts and shook her head as it wasn't the time to be thinking about such things, though the action made her earpiece hum a little louder. Must be a faulty wire, she thought, making a note to ask Ruby to look later. As she continued her search, she knelt down every now and again to investigate some tracks. They were odd, not like anything she had seen before. Multiple thin lines about the width of Gamble's shroud sheath, but the edges were quite wavy. Had the tracks not been so wide, she would have said they belonged to a snake, but while they were wide, they were also too thin to belong to a king taijutsu. "Anything yet?" Ruby said through her earpiece, the voice causing a shiver to run through her for some reason. "No. Found some tracks, could be something else though," Blake replied. "All right." Gods, even her voice is amazing. Again, Blake shook her head free of the thoughts. Focus, Blake. That was easier said than done. Every time she shook her head, the humming from the earpiece seems to get louder, and though it was slightly distracting, it wasn't entirely unpleasant. Thankfully, there was no crackle to it, just a hum that her brain seemed to have found some melody to. Pushing it aside, she returned her focus to the bank, followed the tracks along the water's edge. After 5 minutes of searching, she felt her foot hit something more solid, yet more giving, than a rock and came to a stop. Leaning down, she pushed some of the mud aside, and saw what looked to be a bracelet. Picking it up, she watched all the silver beads drop to the ground and quickly inspected the split ends of the string. It hadn't been torn or ripped away from its owner, but cut. The pink spots that ran along the string itself were enough to tell Blake that the bracelet had not been lost without injury. Pocketing the string and reaching down to pick up the beads, she raised them to eye level. Each one was engraved with a single letter, and though she knew what the word would spell, she rearranged them until the word pearl sat in her hand. Letting out a brief sigh, she stared at them for a second and found herself transfixed. The way the faint light of the sun glinted off of them was almost exactly like the way Ruby's eyes danced in the light. Or when she saw some freshly baked cookies. Or after I kissed her, Blake thought with a smile to herself as she looked at the beads. "Hey, Blake," Yang's voice came over the comms. "Can you stop humming? It's hard to listen for stuff with you in my ear." Yang words caught her off guard. She didn't know when she had started, but her throat was definitely letting out a low rumble in time with the earpiece. "Sorry." Pulling her eyes away from the little balls of metal, she quickly placed them into her pocket alongside the string, and continued her investigation. A low fog was starting to pour into the area, not particularly thick at the moment, but with how fast it was coming on, they likely only had just over an hour before it became too dense to see the other side of the lake. Letting out a sigh that they would likely only be finding tracks today, Blake followed the tracks until they abruptly ended. There were no more tracks. Not on the grass, nor on the bank, so leaning down she inspected the end of them closely. They were deeper, like whatever had left them had dug itself into the mud and jumped. With the extra depth, she could see that the lines weren't in fact solid. Part of them was, the very center being roughly the same thickness as her arm, but shooting off from them were short, thin lines. While Blake didn't know what had left the tracks, she knew what the lines were. Bone. More specifically, the thin, hair-like bones you would see jutting from the spine of a fish. Fish, she thought instinctively. Ruby and Yang had bought her one yesterday and prepared it. After months of decent at best school food, the meal had been a wonderful treat, and Blake had savored every mouthful. The conversation had been pleasant as well. Though Yang and Ruby were still clearly a little upset over Pearl, they all still managed to have a decent time. The night had concluded with Blake and Ruby cuddled up on the couch. Not much had happened except a little hand-holding and a kiss goodnight, but she remembered how it felt to be near her. How she smelt like strawberries, how due to the warmth of the house Ruby had changed into her pajamas, which clung just that little bit more tightly to her body and accentuated her curves. Her mind raced even now as she thought about how badly she wanted to run her hands over those curves, how she wished she had tasted Ruby's neck with her lips when it was so CLO. No, that wasn't right. She hadn't thought those things last night, though she was certainly thinking about them now, and she could barely stop her mind from racing. And why was she humming again? She could feel it, her throat pulsing in time with the song in her head. Something was wrong, these weren't he. Standing up, she looked around and saw the fog was thick enough that she couldn't see her team. But that was too soon as well. Confused by the thoughts, she span around and tried to see through the dense mist. Then she saw her, and her mind eased. Ruby was there. But why was she in the lake? She hadn't told them that she was entering it. And what had happened to her clothes? Why was she barely wearing anything? So they don't get wet, duh, she reasoned to herself, her humming continuing as she took a step towards her girlfriend. The girl seemed to notice her approach and turned to face her, a wide smile painting itself across her face, and she glided effortlessly through the water. an arm raised toward her, and Ruby crooked a finger, clearly wanting Blake to join her. Blake knew she shouldn't, that she was supposed to be doing something. But with her beautiful girlfriend before her and a wonderful song playing in her head, she couldn't remember what that thing was. So with no clear reason not to join her, Blake gave the girl a smile and took a step forward with her own hand outstretched. That was when she heard it. A loud blood-curdling scream that chilled her entire body, as if she had been plunged into the pond itself. Blake! Blake! She was already running as fast as she could, even though she had seen it too late. The pale white, misshapen body that almost looked human from afar that stood in the water, the grotesquely bent arm that was held out to Blake, Blake's own reaching back. By the time she had seen it and took off running, Blake was already underwater, taken by the sea creature to the depths of the pond. She was stupid. So stupid. The lake, the humming, the tracks, the seawater smell and Pearl. She should have realized what was happening. But the river barricades had never failed before, so she hadn't even considered it. But that didn't matter. Hindsight wouldn't help right now. All that mattered was getting to Blake. So stripping her coat and throwing it to the ground as she neared where Blake went under, she prepared to jump in. However, just as she was about to jump, she felt a strong hand close painfully on her shoulder and throw her backwards with enough force that she rolled head over heels a number of times. Finally coming to a stop covered in dirt and mud, she looked up just in time to see Yang's blonde hair disappearing below the water. She wanted to shout out again, to run and join so that they could get Blake together, but her smarts won out. She knew Yang wouldn't fail. She never did. So while she waited with her nerves on edge, she retrieved her coat and ran over to collect Gamble's shroud from where it was left forgotten and scooped it up. By the time she had shoved it onto the back of her belt, a bubbling could be heard coming from the lake, followed by a geyser of water that sent a malformed shape slamming into a rock on the opposite side of the bank. The figure was hideous. Pale white skin stretched over bony ribs so tight that it was torn in places, revealing the organs underneath. The arms were bent and crooked, bones and sharp spines stuck out at odd angles. Its face was the most disturbing. Almost human enough to be deceiving from a distance, but Ruby knew that up close that its eyes were actually covered in a thin fleshy veil that was almost always hidden by a curtain of lank, patchy black hair. From the waist protruded 6 skeletal limbs, each one looking like the carcass of the fish Ruby had thrown away yesterday, and each ending with a malformed eel's head whose jaws snapped at the air. Attached to each the limbs were shining, bulbous yellow sacs. As the siren righted itself and dove back into the water, a disturbance on her side of the bank drew her attention, and she quickly darted forward to meet her sister. Blake was in her arms, her whole body shivering from the ice water she had been plunged into. She was breathing, but it was fast, much too fast. She was gulping like every breath was difficult, and before Ruby could say a word, Yang had thrown the faunus into her arms. "Help her, I have this." Looking at her sister, Ruby saw the blonde's eyes were such a fierce red that she didn't reply and simply obeyed. Before she could move, however, one of the creature's skeletal limbs shot out of the water straight at them, only to be swiftly caught by Yang. "Go!" she bellowed, the limb twisting side to side as it quickly snapped free of Yang's grasp while pulling the girl forward towards the water. A nod was all Ruby could give, and she immediately activated her semblance. Carrying another body was still difficult for her, but there was nothing that could make her fail now, not when so much was at stake. Within a second, Ruby arrived back at the tree-line and placed Blake gently on the floor. She was deathly pale, and she knew the girl's body was going into shock. With one last glance over to her sister, she saw the blonde slam her fists together, her hair glowing brighter than the sun as steam folded off her. Another limb shot out of the water, but Yang seized it and pulled hard. That was all the time she had to watch the two beasts fight, as she knew Blake needed her attention. "Be Blake," Ruby stuttered, trying to get the girl's attention as her trembling hands worked the zipper of the coat down. "I need to GT these off." Blake was panicking, and there was little she could do for that right now. She needed to focus on the main issue, and that was stopping the blood that would be rushing to Blake's chest. With the coat finally open, she shoved the two sides apart and pulled down the zipper, keeping her catsuit in place. She only needed access to Blake's chest, but the zipper didn't go far enough, so she was forced to rip the leather a little deeper into the cleavage. "Just like I wanted to this ammo." Ruby cut her thoughts short, knowing the siren was influencing them. Now that it was exposed, it was spreading its song properly to try to play on their desires to weaken them, but Ruby pushed it from her head and instead focused on helping her girlfriend. Reaching down to her belt, she pulled one of her spare rounds free and put the tip in her mouth. What she was about to do was risky, and that Weiss would berate her if she ever found out, but that wasn't going to stop her, so activating her aura, she bit down as hard as she could and gave it a solid twist, praying the dust inside didn't activate. Thankfully it didn't, and the bullet came free. Without wasting a second, she poured the bright red powder onto Blake's chest and repeated the process with 2 more bullets. When she was sure it was enough, she grabbed for Blake's arms, but they were still flailing slightly as she struggled for breath. "BL Blake, please!" she sobbed, trying to grab the limbs and finally succeeding. "Look at me!" She found her voice firm on her last instruction, and it clearly punctuated Blake's panicked mind as the amber eyes found her own. Emboldened by the newfound focus, Ruby placed the freezing cold hand on the edges of the dust before placing her own on Blake's chest so that they were covered in as much of the powder as possible. Though she normally would have closed her eyes to focus, Blake seemed to need them to stay focused, so gritting her teeth, she gently activated her aura. He erupted between her hands and Blake's skin as the fire dust heated up, but Ruby was careful not to let it fully burn. She needed Blake to warm up, not to burn alive. It was tough. Weiss had stressed how careful she needed to be with the aura flow when teaching her, and Ruby tried to remember everything Weiss had said. Thankfully, she knew she was doing well as her girlfriend's shivers began to slow, as did her breathing. More and more focus returned to Blake's eyes with each passing second until finally one of the hands lifted and closed over her own. Seeing Blake able to move and breathe properly again finally made the tears that had been on the verge of spilling break free, and she let her head hang in relief. "Rue!" She cut the girl off and pressed her lips against the faunus, her relief that Blake was going to be fine too much to stop her. However, less than a second later, she felt a hand on her own chest pushing her away. Help Wai Yang. But you will fine, Blake breathed, her voice still stuttering heavily. PL. Essie. Looking her girlfriend firmly in the eyes for reassurance, she found a strength there and knew it was fine for her to leave. So picking up the coat she had dropped to the ground when placing Blake down, she threw it over the faunus and gave her a fleeting kiss before quickly running to help her sister. As strong as Yang was, even she could only hold off an elder siren for so long. Even the younger ones with their 4 limbs could be a challenge, but as they grew from their battles, they frequently grew extra limbs and even shock sacs. It was those yellow sacs that were causing electricity to run across the limbs, along with causing sparks every time one slammed against the ground. While the current wasn't particularly strong, reports had shown that it was powerful enough to stun for a moment, and even leave a nasty burn should it hit an auraless foe. Seeing one tear through the air towards her sister, who had jumped to avoid another, Ruby activated her semblance and caught her sister. Thanks, sis. Yang breathed quickly once they landed. How's Blake? Fine. Good. Then let's kill this bitch. Another limb surged towards them, the very end tipped with the skeletal head of an eel, its thin needle-like teeth barred. Glowing a bright gold, Yang reared her fist back and took a strong step forward as she struck out. Her fist collided with it, and the bone shattered and scattered across the ground before quickly turning to smoke. Before they could take another step forward to the creature, it retreated further into the lake out of their reach. Knowing that they couldn't fight it in its own habitat, Ruby turned to her sister and gave her a command. We need it out of the water, so don't destroy any more spines. Use them to drag it out. With a nod, Yang rushed to the water's edge. Almost immediately another limb shot out of the water and tried to ensnare her, but Yang caught it easily. Just as it did the first time, the Grim twisted its whole body, and Yang was forced to let go, or risk being pulled in. The moment it was free, it thrashed in a circle and 3 more limbs swept through the air towards them, but they both easily dodged them with a small back step. However, as she vaulted backward, Ruby reached out and caught one of the spines with the hook of her side, just below the eel's head. Once again, the Grim tried to spin free, but since there was no arm to twist, its efforts were useless, and the bones merely scraped along unyielding metal. Its strength was still an issue, however, and if Yang's hand hadn't clamped onto the base of Crescent Rose, Ruby would have likely been pulled into the pond. But Yang and Ruby had been training together for years. They knew each other better than anyone else in the world, and there was nobody in the world she trusted more with a piece of herself. So feeling Yang give a strong tug of the weapon, RWBY trusted Crescent Rose to Yang and took off at a sprint towards the main body. More limbs cracked through the air as they tried to stop her approach, but she ducked and flipped over each of them. She could hear the song getting louder as the creature grew closer, not only from her sprinting but from Yang fishing it out of the lake. RWBY tried to block it out, but she could feel it digging in, dragging the desire from her. Nevertheless, she activated her semblance and jumped up onto the outstretched limb that Yang was pulling at. The main body was almost at the water's edge, the mottled flesh stretching over the torso flickering and smoothing out, the lanky black hair becoming voluminous and darker. The veiled eyes danced between red and amber. But RWBY ignored it, ignored the fact that Blake's body, or what she thought would be Blake's body, was right in front of her, and continued her charge. Limbs flew at her at random, but dodging them with her semblance was effortless. As she reached the flickering body, she leapt and twisted her body in mid-air to deliver a drop kick to the creature's face that would make Yang proud. With the siren off balance, Yang pulled it the rest of the way out of the lake, and RWBY used her semblance to push herself forward to avoid taking a plunge. "RWBY!" Yang's words echoed through the area the second she landed. Looking up, she saw Yang throw her side straight at her with such force that the spinning blur of red sheared straight through another limb. With little effort, RWBY caught it. Crescent Rose was a part of her, and she doubted there would ever come a time where she didn't catch it. And the very moment she felt the metal graze her fingers, she let it slide over her hands and easily altered the momentum to suit her needs. Smacking another limb aside, she let her hand fall to the base, so the head carried her forward, sweeping her off her feet and nimbly avoiding another spine that careened at her. Repositioning her body and the side midair, RWBY jammed the nozzle to the ground and fired off a round to propel her forward. Again her feet collided with the beast, though this time it was its rotted chest, and her knees bent as she gathered her strength. Activating her semblance, she boosted off the creature with enough force to make it stagger backwards towards Yang, just in time to avoid a tentacle that was swung at her. The blonde brute's strong hand quickly wrapped around the thing's head and, with a guttural scream of anger, she twisted her body and threw it as far away from the lake as she could. However, as it soared through the air towards the treeline, RWBY felt something wrap around her ankle and instinctively activated her aura. She barely had time to look down and see the skeletal eel trying to bite into her leg before the momentum of the Grimm's body caught up, and the world turned into a blur of color. She came to a stop as her back slammed into a tree, and pain ran through her body. Aura stopped damage, but that didn't mean you didn't feel it. Thankfully, she had a high pain threshold and quickly shrugged it off. In the impact, the spine on her ankle had slipped, but as she lay face down, her instincts told her something was coming. Listening to them, she rolled to the side just in time to avoid the bones that crashed into the spot she had been laying seconds ago, though she didn't avoid the electricity that sparked from it. One thin string of yellow lightning arced toward her, and her nerves lit on fire, the immediate pain enough to elicit a grunt from her. She knew any normal person would have screamed from the pain, but RWBY gritted her teeth and bore it while standing to her feet. The Grimm was now between them again, its curved, bone limbs holding it a couple of meters off the ground, but this time Yang was the obstacle the thing would have to overcome to get back in the lake. While RWBY would have done her best to stop it getting back into the water, she knew Yang was much better suited for that role if the siren tried for a full-force attempt. So picking up her scythe, RWBY charged forward to attack at the same time that Yang did. The sound of sniper shots and rockets filled the air, and RWBY was aware of a small, repetitive popping that sounded a lot like Blake's weapon. With each shot, more and more dirt and with splinters filled the area as they both fought off the grotesque limbs that tried to keep them at bay. Every time they had a second of reprieve from the lashing tentacles, they would attempt to fire at the hideous creature's face or body, but it always either swayed to the side, like seaweed, or let its body flop disgustingly. While the entire thing was gross, the way the main body moved like it had no bones was enough to make RWBY's stomach churn. "This isn't working, RWBY," she heard Yang shout as she missed another shot. "I can't hit shit. We need to take more. Ugh, limbs off," she panted in return, feeling another spark hit her body as she barely avoided another swipe. "Slow it down. Open to ideas here." Unfortunately, they were making little progress in getting to the body. Though 2 spiny limbs hung uselessly from the waist, it still had 4 left. They were quick too, each one slicing through the air with reckless abandon as it effortlessly repositioned itself with each swing, and getting hit by one guaranteed a shock to the system. She had already received 3 more hits in her attempt to get close, and her muscles screamed more and more each time the shocks ran through her. But she couldn't let it live, so knowing they had to remove more limbs to finish the fight before it exhausted them, she made a decision and smacked away another attempt to wrap her while twisting her body to throw her scythe. Strawberries, she called as she let go of it. The name had originally been Strawberry Sunrise, named after their favorite food and the gold of Yang's hair, but it had also become quickly apparent that the name was too long to say in the midst of battle. Thankfully, it hadn't taken long to get accustomed to the shortened version, and Yang recognized the signal. Got it! She activated her semblance and launched into the air as the scythe hurtled towards Yang. During her ascent, she saw the blonde sidestep yet another tentacle that shot towards her as the Grim dodged the spinning weapon and twisted her body to punch the incoming scythe. Her fist landed perfectly on the butt of the hook, and her gauntlets released a shell that rocketed the scythe into the air, where Ruby was ready to intercept. Emerging from her ball of roses, Ruby landed easily on the top of Crescent Rose and activated her semblance, just as she had against the siren's chest. Careful not to lose its momentum, Ruby boosted herself off the metal and sent it screaming towards the ground as she went even higher. Watching from high on, Ruby saw the short blade attached to the bottom split the ground and forced the weapon to bury itself in the ground. Though the intent had been for the spear to cut through the Grim itself, the siren had dodged it again. However, Yang had the foresight to launch herself off the ground with the power of her gauntlets and seize 2 of the tentacles as Crescent Rose continued even deeper, the 2 long bony limbs that Yang held being severed cleanly when it finally bottomed out like a miniature guillotine. Ruby watched everything as she rose higher into the air, Yang growing smaller and smaller until she was barely recognizable below. But as she felt her ascent slow and began to descend, she activated her semblance again and shot straight to the ground. It took less than 2 seconds for her to reach a speed so fast that she could no longer keep her eyes open, not that she needed them to be. She trusted Yang's aim. They had worked on the move for years and gone over it in meticulous detail. So, while at full speed, she reached out both hands and felt a warmth meet them as she caught Yang's dust rockets. Aerg! Less than a second later, she struck the ground with such force that she knew every bone in her body would have been broken without her aura. That force was what she needed though. Pain exploded across her body as the first hardened ground cracked and fractured, the deep fissure spreading out from her landing point like spider webs. Without losing a single ounce of the momentum, she dropped to her knees and slammed the dust into the crater. The force of her landing combined with the explosion of the dust caused a devastating shockwave to erupt around her, the fire dust mingling with the wave to give it a burning orange hue and an incredible amount of heat. From what other people had said, when they had seen her practice it with Yang, she knew it would look to an outsider like a large bomb was going off. The force of the shockwave threw everything backwards. Dirt, rocks, chunks of the earth that had cracked when Ruby landed, even the Grim that she had landed right next to. The vile thing spun helplessly in the air, and Yang launched herself up to finish it. Apparently the siren wasn't done yet, however, as a limb struck out at the blonde. With the momentum of it spinning along with its strength, the force of the strike sent Yang plummeting to the leaf-covered forest floor with such force that she bounced off the hard ground and her aura flickered for a second, but not enough to give out. Thankfully she stood up a second later, the limb that had struck her dangling lifelessly from where she had caught it as it slowly faded into smoke. Pulling Crescent Rose from the ground proved easy due to it being so cracked from her landing, but as she stood up properly, she felt her body scream bloody murder at her for what she had just done to it. She knew that both she and Yang were low on aura, but thankfully the Grim was done for. Turning to face where she had heard it land, she saw it laying helplessly on the ground. With only one limb remaining, it was no longer able to stand, no longer able to dodge or do anything to save itself. The only thing it could do was drag itself along the cold earth with its weak, broken arms that were only fit for holding something underwater. In a last attempt to save itself, the final limb shot towards Yang, but once again the girl's hair glowed like the sun as she caught it. Knowing shocks would be running through Yang's already weak body, Ruby raised her sniper and shot the limb off at the middle. With the head that allowed it to move gone, the final spine dropped pathetically to the ground and remained still. Watching Yang walk over to it, Ruby returned her weapon to its scythe form, the noise echoing across the now silent area and drawing Yang's eye. The blonde seemed to understand, and instead of finishing it instantly, she reached down to seize a clump of the horrid black hair to hold it up. As the body was picked up, the thin arms tried to scratch at Yang with its sharp claws, but the gold shimmer of Yang's aura protected her. All yours, sis. There was no rush now. Its fate was sealed after all, so Ruby held her side to her side and walked calmly towards the despicable creature. She had never been one for hate. Never in her life had she actually hated a person, and knew she never would, no matter what they had done. But these things, they were not human. They didn't have feelings, or mercy. All they did was kill and ruin lives. How many had the one before her killed to grow so strong? 10? 50? 100? Likely the latter. Then it had killed a friend, a child taken from her family forever, and then tried to kill Blake. It was those thoughts that rushed to the forefront of her mind and told her everything she needed to know. The pathetic thing in front of her was one thing she hated with her whole being. However, as she was almost in killing range, something happened that caused Ruby some confusion. One of the veils that covered its eyes had split open during the fight, and the black ball beneath was visible, the red iris in the center spasming around in the socket. But as Ruby drew closer, the red stopped spinning and locked into her own silver eyes. It was then that it happened. The red contracted and the body began to squirm more. The weak arms that had been meekly clawing at Yang's began frantically scratching and tearing at the thing holding it in place. With every step, the thrashing grew more and more frantic as the red eye refused to stray away from her own silver ones. It was then that Ruby saw it, an emotion. Not love or anything redeeming, but fear. Pure, unrestrained fear. Good, Ruby thought viciously as she finally got close enough and slowly raised her scythe with aching arms. Let it be scared. Let it feel the fear that all its victims felt. Holding the scythe high in the air for a moment, Ruby took a deep breath. Expelling it slowly, she brought the heavy metal weapon down. The blade slid through the rotted, pale flesh with ease, and the writhing instantly stopped as the body slumped lifelessly to the floor. Straightening up, she saw the head still dangling from Yang's hands by the thin strands of hair, its mouth dropping open to reveal 2 rows of broken, chipped teeth. However, after a couple of seconds, smoke began to rise, and the head slowly disintegrated from the neck upward. Just before it was done, Yang dropped it carelessly to the floor. Bitch! Yang growled, spitting on what little remained of the skull before turning to look her way. You okay? Yeah, Ruby breathed, whole body screaming at her as the adrenaline faded. We should get Blake. She was cut off as she looked at her girlfriend. Home. Littered around the treeline were smoking Beowulf bodies. Ruby hadn't even noticed, but it appeared Blake had recovered enough to protect them from any other Grimm that had tried to join the fight. But the fight seemed to have drained what energy the girl had left, and Ruby quickly rushed forward as Blake struggled to pull her sword from the corpse of a vulpine beast. Arriving just in time as Blake's legs gave out, Ruby wrapped a hand around her waist and kept her steady. You should have called for help, Ruby said with a sigh as she heaved Blake up to her feet, but merely receiving a slight chuckle in return. I'm fine, she replied, her voice clearly very tired despite her words. Can you maybe scold me at home now? So I can lay down? She was most certainly going to scold Blake for putting herself in danger without telling them, but for right now, she needed to thank her. As Blake finally found her feet, Ruby pressed in and kissed her. With no Grimm or emergency to interrupt them, Ruby put as much feeling into it as she could, before pulling away to give her a smile. Thank you for protecting us. All right, you two, save the cute stuff for later, Yang said before Blake could reply, taking Blake from Ruby with a groan. We all need some rest. Ruby couldn't lie. Rest sounded really good as her entire body was screaming for her to sit down, so much so that even the walk home seemed daunting. So giving her sister nothing more than a nod, she slipped her hand into Blake's, and the 3 of them slowly made their way back to the house.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.